Back to Seaside Joe. I'm Kenneth Arthur, and the Seahawks play the Broncos in a matter of 5 days. And I keep coming back to this one idea, which is just what if? What if Russell Wilson was still on the Seahawks? And what if the Denver Broncos had signed Geno Smith to be their new starter over, Drew Lock, Teddy Bridgewater, what they were working with last season? What if they had turned to Geno Smith? And what if it was Geno Smith versus Russell Wilson, as it is going to be on Monday night at Lumen Field? Would anybody expect the Seahawks, or should I say Geno Smith, to beat Russell Wilson? Now, there are other factors here at play. There are other players and coaches and personnel and designs and all that, of course. But ultimately, this game is so heavily predicated on the success and the value and the talent and the abilities of your quarterback. And obviously, as we enter the 2022 season, one of the big things that everybody's centering their focus on is the Seahawks quarterback situation with Geno Smith. So there are ways to maybe talk about how Seattle could gussy up, I guess, so to speak, Geno Smith, and give him all the opportunities necessary to beat the Denver Broncos, or to at least, have an efficient and successful offense up to the amount that a Geno Smith-led offense can have. And I don't think the Denver Broncos are a great team. And I don't think the Denver Broncos, in my bonus post on Tuesday at seasidejoe.com, go check that out, I said that the Denver Broncos would finish in last place in the AFC West. Now, that's not really that's not an indictment of the Broncos necessarily. It's just sort of, hey, you're in the AFC West. This is what Russell Wilson wanted. He wanted to be traded to the Denver Broncos, and he got traded to the Denver Broncos. He's now in the same division as Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert. So those two guys, I'm never going to really doubt Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Herbert's been my guy since 2020. So I have really no reason to expect either of them to finish in last place. They've got enough talent around them. I think Justin Herbert has more talent on the Chargers around him than Patrick Mahomes has with the Chiefs right now. And by the way, if you're here in the live chat of the stream, if there is anything's going wrong, please send in a comment or something like that. Let me know, or just send any questions at all. We're playing a very loose format today. I'll be joined by Thad Wenatchee here shortly. It's just a very loose Seahawks chat 5 days before the game. So anything you have to say, go ahead and add it there in the chat. But the Seahawks and the Broncos, when you look at the Broncos, you see, it's going to come down to the Raiders or the Broncos for third place. And that third place team is going to be a playoff team, I think, most likely in AFC too. Will the fourth team be a playoff team? It's possible. It could happen. I think the Broncos, even being in last place in the AFC West, it could look like 8-9. It could look like 9-8, something in the 500-ish range. Because, I do think that they are going to probably get the win on Monday night against the Seahawks. That's sort of the thesis statement where I'm ultimately driving to here, is that I do believe, I'm not long. I think I lost audio a little bit here or something. I got to be careful with that because I'm holding the mic. Kenneth Arthur, Seaside Joe. I lost the listener. That's okay. Well, I shouldn't even mention it because some of you are listening. Most of you are listening to this on your podcast. So go listen to this on the podcast, Seaside Joe, a football podcast on your podcast apps. But the Seahawks, a month ago or so, I was writing, preview of September, preview of the season, what it could happen. And you looked at those first 4 games, the Broncos at home, the 49ers, who the Seahawks have consistently beaten over the last 4 or 5 years, the Falcons and the Lions. And, the Falcons, I think, are even worse than the Seahawks. And the Lions, I do like a lot of what they're doing, but I still expect them. I was watching Hard Knocks, and you get very hyped up and pumped up for a team with on Hard Knocks, especially a team coached by Dan Campbell and his assistant coaches and all those players. So it's very hard to not get hyped up on the Denver Broncos, the Detroit Lions. And I just had to all of a sudden it hit me like during the third or fourth episode, like, oh my God, that's right. Jared Goff is the quarterback. And how did we all of a sudden get to this point where Jared Goff is expected to just be an unquestioned starter? Like, he didn't have any competition. He didn't have any challenges. He is really just like, oh yeah, no, Jared Goff for the second year in a row is the Lions starter. So that's the Seahawks schedule there in the first 4 games. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, 3-1. Is it that crazy? 3-1. You got Russell Wilson, a guy who you know so well, and the Broncos team that's not, to me, that fantastic. I think defensively, Justin Simmons, the safety, is one of the better players at his position. There's players with talent, experience, and overall, I think, Denver does have just a stronger overall roster than the Seahawks do by a hair, not including the quarterback. But then when you get to the quarterback, it's like, hey, if we're talking about Russell Wilson versus Geno Smith, I just spent 10 years defending Russell Wilson as a great quarterback. How am I going to go now and flip on that and completely change everything that I've been saying for the last 10 years? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's the one thing that I just want to continue to emphasize to Seahawks fans is just remember we spent all those years defending Russell Wilson, hyping him up, talking about how he's better than, any number of quarterbacks. It gets tired now to even bring up the debates about Andrew Luck, or, the list goes on and on, Cam Newton and Colin Kaepernick, and every single challenger that came along, I would go and say, well, okay, let me fairly evaluate. Is this quarterback as good as Russell Wilson? And so many of them, with the exception of, 5 or 6, just weren't. And they all fell by the wayside. Jared Goff being one of them. Marcus Mariota being one of them, the Seahawks' potential opponent in week 4. Obviously, or week 3, they'll play the Lions. So, or excuse me, Marcus Mariota, week 4. I don't know. I'm out of my mind, but I'm thinking about how we spent all those years just like, hey, Russell Wilson is good. He's going to win games. He's going to give you that opportunity to win games. So how is it conscionable to have Russell Wilson defense for 10 years? And then all of a sudden, just because he's not on the Seahawks anymore and he's on the Broncos instead, not only are the Seahawks without Russell Wilson and facing Russell Wilson, but the change is Geno Smith. If the change was Matt Ryan, which I do not support, I would not support. I know that some people would have supported an addition of Matt Ryan. I know some people would have supported going out there and get Baker Mayfield. I know some people would have supported, any number of other veteran quarterback options who have started games and been named starters for NFL teams within the last 2 to 3 years, let alone, spending the last 7 as a pure backup like Geno Smith has been. And that's where I think, if the Seahawks had the 17th best quarterback in the NFL, maybe it would be okay, well, this is a bad drop-off, but it's not like a huge drop-off. There is a distinct possibility that Geno Smith, forget about not one of the top 32 starting quarterbacks. I mean, wherever he ranks, in week 1, it's very possible that he'll rank 32nd. And that's okay. And I'm not disparaging Geno Smith. I'm not trash talking anybody. That's just an objective reality. That's the type of reality that I think any outsider point of view has right now. Remember Mike Florio, Pro Football Talk, Chris Sims, both of them agreed without any sort of objection whatsoever, without even really bringing up another name, that Geno Smith was the only quarterback that's purely on the hot seat right now entering the season. Now, of course, I think that's incorrect to some degree. I think Marcus Mariota being one example of a guy who is on the hot seat. Trey Lance, the week 2 opponent, is on the hot seat. Jared Goff is very distinctly possible that if the Bull, because the Lions do have a lot of, looks like I'm having mic issues. Very possible that Jared Goff, could get pulled. There's a lot of quarterbacks out there who stink right now. That's stink is sort of like a term that's a little over the top, maybe. But there's a lot of quarterbacks out there who, like I say, there's like a dozen QBs at any given time that could be benched, and that's just the way that it is. You've got your top 5 or 6, and then you've got the Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr guys who will not be really challenged, but you're not expecting them to lead you to the Super Bowl. You got to put a lot of good talent around them, and then everybody else is sort of just replaceable. Geno Smith being one of those guys, Marcus Mariota being one of those guys, Jared Goff being one of those guys. We'll find out about Trey Lance. This is why I said that Geno Smith or Drew Lock could easily be top, like the 20th best or the 22nd best quarterback in the NFL when we're making these lists in November or October. Why? Just go down around the league. You've got Tua Tagovailoa. You've got Mitchell Trubisky. You've got, a question mark like Trevor Lawrence or Zach Wilson or Justin Fields or Trey Lance, all of these second-year quarterbacks that we know nothing about, Mac Jones even. You've got the Daniel Jones situation, who we just kind of like overlook, similar to Jared Goff. Like, how is this guy an unquestioned starter? I think that Tyrod Taylor could easily be starting for the Giants by week 2 or 3 or 4 or 7. So there's a lot of guys out there who aren't necessarily looking that good. And, then you've got just the Geno Smith is just the one guy who's sitting there going, well, this wasn't the plan, right? I mean, this was the plan. And, Pete Carroll will tell you, he's been the number one guy on the depth chart for this entire, off season. So I guess it was the plan, but is the plan for this season or is the plan for the next 10 seasons? I think that you don't want to call it tanking. You just would say, where are the Seahawks at right now? They might be accepting, then it's not necessarily tanking, it's accepting. And so for the Seahawks to accept their situation going into this offseason, I think they said, okay, what's our situation? We feel like the Seahawks, we just had a 7-10 season. And Russell Wilson, yes, he was out for 3 games. Maybe instead of going 1-2 in those games, the Seahawks would have gone 2-1. And then you've got the next 3 games after he returned when he looked really terrible. Maybe instead of, losing those games, maybe the Seahawks win an extra game. At the end of the day, how much different were the Seahawks going to be with a healthy Russell Wilson from 7-10, 9-8, 10-7? A 10-7 Seahawks team going into this offseason with their financial constraints, with their free agents, with their aging players, instead of if they had kept on Russell Wilson, they would have probably had to re-sign Dwayne Brown. Brandon Shell, by the way, nobody even signed him. And that was the Seahawks starting right tackle last year. So the Seahawks probably would have had, Dwayne Brown in there. Maybe they would have drafted Boy Mafe and then Abe Lucas in the 3rd round. That means no Charles Cross. That means no Ken Walker. And that means that the Seahawks would be going into this game with, Russell Wilson and looking at their last 5-6 seasons thinking, well, wow, we were just 10-7. If they'd gotten all the wins that they probably were capable of getting last year, what's really going to be the outcome this year? 10-7, a 1st-round exit? Are the Seahawks right now, as currently set up, prepared if they had Russell Wilson and Dwayne Brown instead of, Geno Smith and all that, what they're currently at? If they had stuck with that plan, were they better than the Rams? Were they better than the Packers? Were they better than the Saints? Were they better than the Bucks? Were they better than the Eagles, the Cowboys, the Vikings, the 49ers, the Cardinals? Where the Seahawks were at with Russell Wilson probably comes in 7th or 8th in the NFC. So I think they assessed that situation at the beginning of the offseason. You can read Brady Henderson's article at ESPN this morning, sort of detailing some of the stuff that went on behind the scenes in the last few years and then leading up to the trade this year. I think they assessed all of that stuff. They said, we don't want to be the 7th best team in the NFC. We're okay with being the 15th best team in the NFC right now. Go out there next year, the 2023 draft, which is going to be the best quarterback draft since 2018, and go get the quarterback of your dreams. And I think one of those other things, the biggest takeaway for me from that Brady Henderson article, because I'm such a big draft guy and I'm such a big quarterback draft guy, the biggest takeaway for me was that John Schneider had a little obsession with Patrick Mahomes, had a little obsession with Josh Allen to the point where he was flirting with trading Russell Wilson for the number 1 pick. I don't know, like if he got rejected by the way, if he got rejected by the Browns for the number 1 pick, why didn't he call some of these other teams? There was the Bills traded up for Josh Allen. With that team with the pick on the Josh Allen trade, was it the Cardinals? I don't know, but it wasn't the Cardinals because they drafted Josh Rosen. But whatever team it was, this couldn't John Schneider have just called another team? I don't know how that all works out, but overall, I guess you would have to want Russell Wilson and the contract and all that stuff. But ultimately, I think that the Seahawks have all these interests that they've had in quarterbacks, and they've never been able to draft one as like a real big prospect. In the entire franchise history of the Seahawks, the only 2 first-round quarterbacks are Dan McGuire and Rick Mirer. So not a very good track record and not a very extensive track record. The Seahawks don't take those shots. No matter who the GM is, no matter who the head coach is, they haven't taken those shots. And as I wrote before earlier in the offseason at Seaside Joe, the Seahawks and Pete Carroll, he's never really had the opportunity to draft a quarterback. You go back to 2010, that draft, they wanted to get their left tackle. That was the best player on the board, so they got Okung. Mark Sanchez was the only real quarterback prospect at the time. And the Seahawks obviously didn't want him, and he was drafted ahead of them anyway. But then in 2011, the Seahawks were drafting, because they won that playoff game against the Saints and made the playoffs, they were drafting in the late 20s. That wasn't the opportunity to draft a quarterback either. And then in 2012, they were picking 12th, and it was either trade up for Ryan Tannehill, stay where you're at and take Brandon Weeden, or try one of the quarterbacks on day 2. And obviously, John Schneider and the front office had started to become enamored with this guy, Russell Wilson. So they picked Russell Wilson in the 3rd round and risked the possibility of that not even happening. But that is what happened. And then for the next 10 years, didn't draft a quarterback for obvious reasons, even though it sounds like the Seahawks very much would have liked to draft Patrick Mahomes if the Chiefs didn't realize also that he was a very special player. And it makes you think, while I know that it would have pissed off Russ Wilson, I know that it would have set the stage for the end of the Russell Wilson era, should the Seahawks have traded up instead of the Chiefs, because the Chiefs were all the way back at, I think, pick 26 when they traded up for that pick number 10 to draft Patrick Mahomes. You also had Deshaun Watson at pick number 12, and the Texans traded up for him too. So the Seahawks were sitting there. That was probably, I'm sure, something that John Schneider will always think about, just about what he could have done for Josh Allen. Some would say those are the 2 best quarterbacks in the NFL. And his other quarterback, that he obviously liked was Russell Wilson. Now, he also thought that Drew Lock was a very special player, and we haven't seen that come to fruition yet because he didn't beat out Geno Smith. But I think that one of the big takeaways from Brady Henderson's article is John Schneider, like me, is obsessed with the 2023 draft of quarterbacks. So any talk of the Seahawks, first of all, not drafting a quarterback within the first 3 rounds is absurd. I think, the Seahawks have 4 picks in the first 2 rounds. I was just thinking about this the other day. If the Seahawks, really, if the Broncos are, what I think they are, which is like an average team, the Seahawks are looking at 4 picks in the top 50 of the next year's draft. They'll have more capital than any other team. I wrote that at seasidejoe.com. So that's something that I keep emphasizing. And John Schneider, I think, is very much overdue to draft an early quarterback. Now, setting aside my own obsession with Grayson McCall and what I think he could do in the future or how his draft stock's going to be, it doesn't really matter. If John Schneider is, more obsessed with a Will Levis, obviously I've not put Will Levis very high on my list of priorities, but I'm not, the end all, of what's going to happen and who's going to be good. Could be a guy like Will Levis, could be a guy like Anthony Richardson. Or if the Seahawks are bad enough, it could be Bryce Young. I think the Seahawks do need to be the worst team in the NFL for it to be Bryce Young. There's only a few situations really where a team could get the number one pick and not need a quarterback. You'd be talking about if the Jaguars had the number one pick next year. Well, what happened to Trevor Lawrence through his first 2 seasons? That would be one question, of course. If the Jets, same thing with Zach Wilson. It could be the Bears. And then you're talking about similar to the Cardinals and Kyler Murray and Josh Rosen, maybe trading Justin Fields to a team that does need a quarterback. I don't want that to be the Seahawks, but you maybe see something in that line of thinking. There's just only a few teams, though, especially because there was only one quarterback picked in the first 2 rounds this year, which is Kenny Pickett. There's not really that many situations where there's going to be an acceptable quarterback who has the worst record in the NFL. Those are the situations like having Trevor Lawrence in 2021, having the worst record, drafting Trayvon Walker. You can pick anybody besides you don't need a quarterback. But next year, it's setting up not to really be that way. So I would expect the Seahawks to not get Bryce Young unless they have the number one pick, because whoever has the number one pick, and there's a lot of teams that seem to be vying for it, they all seem to want that. There's a lot of teams with multiple first round picks, but none have quite as much capital as the Seahawks, it's looking like, because they have those 2 second round picks, and they also are likely to be bad. And the Broncos pick, to me, is not going to be in the late 20s at least. So I think that they're one of the possibilities, but then you see the Houston Texans, just an awful, awful, awful team that tried to get the number one pick, I think, last year, and it didn't quite work out that way. But obviously just setting up perfectly for a quarterback to be placed on the Houston Texans. The Detroit Lions, again, are a team like that. The Atlanta Falcons would draft a quarterback. I don't think there's any chance that Desmond Ridder has really will earn that over the opportunity to draft someone young. So for the Seahawks, I expect it to be very difficult to get. But people talk about this thing is that people talk about. Well, I know that the Seahawks won't be bad enough to draft Bryce Young or C.J. Stroud. I don't really like that talk so much because, we just don't know. We just don't know what the draft order is going to be. Let's talk about it when it gets a little bit closer, draft order wise. We have no fucking idea. And second of all, we have no idea how these prospects are going to shake out. So many quarterback prospects. Now, look, I am of the opinion that Bryce Young doesn't even need to play football right now. He could end his college career at Alabama, enter the 2023 draft now, and be the number one pick. He was the top recruit out of high school. He was a Heisman. He was great. I mean, he does everything. He's got the skill. It's not just that he's surrounded by talent. He's actually the most player on the field. He's the most exciting player on the field to actually watch play for Alabama, which is saying a lot. I mean, offensively, obviously, they got Will Anderson on defense. Who's going to come in and stop Alabama from making college football a non-competitive sport? Who knows? That's the question that's gone on forever. But we just don't know. Like, I think Bryce Young is going to be fine as the number one pick, but C.J. Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Will Levis, all of those guys, Tyler Van Dyke, all these quarterback prospects, I still think there will be 5 or 6 first-round quarterbacks, and we just don't know how it's going to shake out. So all this, I don't think there's any point to start resigning yourself to the Seahawks need to trade up, or the Seahawks won't get this guy, so they need to focus on that guy. It's not just about whether or not Will Levis, I just don't really ascribe to that. Let's follow the season together at SeasideJoe.com. Let's follow the college football season together. Let's see how the draft order shakes out. Let's talk about these prospects once we get a better idea of them. Because last year, going into the season, I followed every quarterback prospect for the 2022 draft time after time after time. And every single week when I thought, oh, well, now Malik Willis is stepping up, 2 weeks later, he would just be like, wait a minute, this guy is not a close to a first round pick. What are we even talking about? Every time somebody would get a little bit better and you would think, oh, okay, it'll be that guy, or it'll be this guy. It's just like, Desmond Ritter's just not that exciting. Sam Howell's just not very consistent. And I don't know that he's going to be a fit for the NFL. Carson Strong, just not a very, just a huge arm and not a lot else, and a very concerning injury history. And that was the situation week after week after week with last year's class. This year's class, much different, because we're actually going into it with a lot of players who did excel last season, but I couldn't talk about them because they weren't eligible. Now, obviously, I had Grayson McCall as my number one quarterback for the 2022 class, but then he didn't declare. So he's back at Coastal Carolina. And I got asked why. And I'm just going to reiterate, it's not because he didn't have the offers. He had plenty of opportunities. Everybody, I think, in college football, the people in the know that even though he runs a triple option offense and he's only ever run that since high school, that it's just that his intelligence, his processing speed, his accuracy is insane. His athleticism is like nobody, really understands how athletic he is. He's such a good runner. He's so careful with the football, so protective of the football. He doesn't make a lot of boneheaded mistakes. I had people telling me, like, why don't you point out Grayson McCall's, faults more often? Doesn't really have that many. His bad plays are not very often. They don't happen very often. Now, that's partly because they don't throw the ball very often at Coastal Carolina. But anyway, I just think that let's see how these players play out. And I know now I feel more confident that John Schneider has, like me, been obsessed with the 2023 quarterback class for at least a couple of years now. And so I have no doubt that the Seahawks are going to be one of, if not the most aggressive team at getting a franchise in the draft. If John Schneider feels any regrets about not getting Patrick Mahomes and not getting Josh Allen, he's going to use that as fuel to go up and get probably somebody, like a Bryce Young, like a CJ Stroud, like a, Anthony Richardson or Will Levis or whatever. I don't think Will Levis is going to be a first round pick. I don't even think Will Levis is going to be a second round pick yet. If he goes out there and plays a different game on film than he played in the last year, then I'll change my opinion. But I'm just saying right now, I haven't seen a lot of 23-year-olds. He'll be 24 as a rookie in the NFL, which means forget about him being successful as a rookie. So forget about his age 24 season. His second season probably would have a lot of rough patches. So forget about his age 25 season. Maybe he'd be great by his age 26 season in the NFL, which is another reason why I'm just not a big Will Levis guy. Grayson McCall is 22. So I think that's just something that works a little bit more for him and Tyler Van Dyke and Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. All those guys, Anthony Richardson, who are not as old as Will Levis, who didn't transfer because they didn't win a job at Penn State or wherever other school, but for Will Levis, that was Penn State against Sean Clifford. He didn't win that job over Sean Clifford, who not very many people would talk about as an NFL prospect. But I think, and look, transfers are just going to be a part of the college football now. Almost within a couple of years, maybe 60 or 70% of starting quarterbacks in college football will have transferred. So I don't necessarily just really know what's going to happen, though. So maybe by next March or April, I'll say, yeah, I'm very excited about Will Levis. But for now, I think the Seahawks most likely will be very aggressive in that first round range of trying to go out there and get a quarterback, unless, maybe the Seahawks are in a position to draft Will Anderson with their first pick. Like, let's say they're picking second and the Lions are picking first, and the Lions pick Bryce Young, and the Seahawks go, well, shoot, we got 3 more picks in the top 50. We've got, and by the way, the first round will have no Miami Dolphins in it. So it's actually 31 teams in the first round. So the team that picks first will actually, in a way, have 2 first-round picks because they'll be picking 32nd in the second round. So, is there an echo? Well, I don't know what to do about that. Hopefully, unfortunately, it's probably been a bad situation if you've had to hear that echo. But I don't know what to. This is my first time trying this current system of recording, so that's why I didn't really have any idea what would happen. This is a test run, but I do think it's interesting that the Seahawks will have that situation and that opportunity probably next year to draft a quarterback, and I think that will happen, and it will happen fairly early in their draft plans, but it is possible that they go out and they get a guy like Will Anderson with their first pick. Maybe their second pick is 17th, and they could decide at that point, hey, similar to trading up for Patrick Mahomes, similar to trading up for Josh Allen, similar to, a lot of teams trade up for quarterbacks just because they need one, and then another team doesn't need one, and this is the third or the fourth quarterback off the board. I could see the Seahawks at that point deciding, hey, let's use our 17th pick and our 33rd pick and trade up to pick 9, and there you'll select Anthony Richardson or whatever. Is it possible that in the second, on day 2, they go, hey, look, we're in love with this guy like McCall or, Kevin Leary or whoever it is. There's a lot of interesting options for day 2 and day 3, similar to Russell Wilson going, hey, look, this is the Seahawks. This is what we do. We're not going to panic about the quarterback position. Let's get Will Anderson. Let's go get Jordan Addison, wide receiver USC, and then we'll get the quarterback on day 2. We're not going to panic. That's a very Seattle Pete Carroll thing to do, so we'll see what happens. If I'm having audio issues, which I can't really hear right now, I'm going to have to go back and listen to it. But I have, I'm going to go ahead and end this broadcast because I don't want to have audio issues, and I don't want anyone to have to deal with listening to audio issues. So thanks for listening to this short episode of Seaside Joe. Follow at seasidejoe.com. And the next time you hear me, I will not have these issues.